Well, welcome everybody that you came here out of all the other things you could be doing. I'm flattered. I'm going to be reading a story from my new collection, Tell Me Like You've Done Before, and Other Stories Written on the Shoulders of Giants, which contains stories written in homage of people who have helped make me me. The particular story I'm going to read part of is called Opossums and Angels. I don't know how many people here are familiar with James Tiptree Jr., Alice Sheldon. It doesn't really matter whether you are or not, it will just add some extra little fillip to the story. This is a story that combines elements of the two favorite stories of hers that I like, the Screwfly Solution and The Women Men Don't See, and it sort of posits a joint sequel to both of them if the protagonist of one ended up bumping into the protagonist of another. I hope that knowledge of that story is not necessary to enjoy the story, but that's just sort of the background of what this particular story is. It's one of the two original ones in this collection. Anne woke before dawn, snug in her sleeping bag beside the big rock by the swamp, and looked up at the stars, which would soon fade, trying to remember how many months it had been since she'd last seen what the men had taken to calling angels. She frowned, unable to count the time, as her struggle to survive had left one day looking very much like the next. But one thing she was certain, it had to have been longer ago than when she'd last tried and failed to rise to the challenge of killing herself. As the sun rose, she turned her head to the epitaph she'd scratched months before along the rock face, though the fact she was still around to read it meant it was still merely words, and had yet to actually become an epitaph. Her marks were difficult to make out at first, but then the rising sun cast shadows within the gashes she'd made, and soon the letters were legible again. Here lies the second meanest primate on earth. Reading that, she felt chastened by her former self, felt as if she ought to apologize to her for not having gone through with it, but she just hadn't been able to do it. She couldn't, even though at least once each day she promised herself she would. If only she could have been sure she wasn't the last woman on earth, it might have been easier. If she knew perhaps that another was safely tucked away in some Easter Island cave waiting for the right moment to rise up among the moai, then... But she had no way of knowing. So maybe she was the last, and if in fact she was, it didn't seem right for her to go out that way. Not by her own hand, not when it meant that men and the glowing visitors they mistook for angels would win. So it was just as well she was cut off from the rest of the world, more cut off than even she, as the horror of what was really happening dawned on her, had expected she would need in order to live. She thought she'd been remote enough in the mountain cabin toward which Barney had pointed her. Barney, oh poor Barney, but it was only this, sleeping where nothing but animals slept, eating raw fish so no cook fire would reveal her existence, rubbing herself in animal fat so the smell of anything but a woman would spill off of her that had kept her alive due to both isolation and ignorance. If she'd known there were others out there like her, other hidden women who'd managed to survive the brutal days when men went mad but didn't know it, she might have been able to let it all go, fulfill the promise of those words above her. Words no one would probably ever read, not human nor supposed angel either. I saw them, Amy, she whispered during that bridge moment prior to being fully awake, realizing as soon as she spoke what she'd forgotten and been forced to remember hundreds of times before, that her daughter was not there. But a mother's mind plays what tricks it can, and self-delusion was much easier than living with the constant knowledge that your husband had filled with bloodlust as inescapably as any other man and had killed her. Amy, her beautiful, precious Amy, dead at Alan's hands. Alan, the most gentle of men, who'd fought so hard to protect them, until the angels, who once she finally saw one herself she realized were nothing but aliens, turned his loving instincts into murder and gave him a reason to kill, as all men had been given a reason to kill all women, and all women were killed, all perhaps but her. She rose from her sleeping bag and headed back down to the cabin after weeks, at least she guessed it was weeks, away. She had to abandon it when men started sniffing around. Oh, she dealt with them quite handily, at least the first few, until there were too many, many too many. But now, did she really have to keep hiding? If they were going to get her, if they were going to fulfill their task of clearing the earth for what was to come, they'd surely have done so by now. The front door of the cabin hung loose and its contents were trashed as she expected they'd be. She carried away what she could when she fled to the swamp, but much had to be left behind. Plates had been smashed, the Turner print on the wall had been punched right through, the sheets on which she'd slept had been shredded. Even the sturdy cot was now shattered into pieces. The bent branches from which Barney had shaped it splintered and scattered to the corners of the room. She could imagine them, the men who had lost their minds, puffed up with rage, growling like apes, driven mad by the pheromones she couldn't help but leave behind, destroying everything they could because they were unable to destroy her. Though the mounds outside the cabin, beneath which were buried the ones who'd come for her first, and singly, showed they weren't the only ones capable of destruction. She built a fire, and as she gathered what papers she could find to get it started, it wasn't clear to her whether she no longer cared whether attackers might be drawn by the smoke, or if she hoped they'd all been destroyed anyway, having turned at last on themselves. Beneath one of the piles, apparently dropped and forgotten during the ransacking, she found a well-read copy of Reverend Michelini's ludicrous pamphlet, Man Listens to God, which attempted to justify the slaughter. She crumpled its pages one at a time and happily tossed them into the flames. She watched the pages blacken, wishing she could gather and burn every copy. God that always justified a lot could even make aliens over into angels. Well, it looked like the aliens had gotten their way and Earth was devoid of people. Almost, anyway. So why had it been so long since she'd seen one? They'd gotten rid of the native population with no mess, no craters, no radioactivity, so why hadn't they returned yet to claim it for their own? As she hunched over the flames, the hinges of the hanging door behind her creaked, and she spun to see a man, a shaggy, filthy man, standing there in the open doorway, holding his right wrist tight with the fingers of his left hand, waging an internal war against what the aliens had planted inside him. "Stay back," he croaked, his jaw twitching. "Keep away from me." Stay back? He was the one who'd come for her, and what did he fear? It was his kind who'd slaughtered all of hers, and it seemed to her as if he was about to continue the bloodbath. No man had yet been able to win against the new self he'd been given, so no, she would not stay back, not even though she could see his struggle to remain rational. No time to drop to her boot for the knife she kept there, so she slipped a hand into a pocket for the fishing hooks which had fed her and launched herself at him. She wedged the barbs between her knuckles and swung for his face, shrieking out her hate for him and all like him. She knew, no matter how overwhelmed he was by the bloodlust the aliens had instilled in all men, that he couldn't help but flinch. She'd seen it before when she took down men larger than him. Those reactions were planted even deeper than what the conquerors had left behind. "Wait, you don't understand," he said, backpedaling away. "Stay away from me, please." He retreated as she neared him, tripping over the lip of the door and falling. When she was almost upon him, his pleas faded and his demeanor changed. At first he'd been blank and exhausted, though no less a threat. There was no longer such a thing as a trustworthy man in this world. But suddenly he was angry and filled with energy. As she leapt atop him, he flailed, growling. "Bitch," he called her gutturally as his blows went wide. She was too close for him to swing cleanly. His forearms collided dully with her shoulders, but just close enough for her to do what she needed to do. She'd been a doctor in the old world, so she knew just where to press and for how long, and that was that. Once he was still, she stood, panting, and wondered what to do with him. She should kill him, she knew. She'd done it before, after all, and had even gotten better at it, though she still had to force herself to think of Amy and the aliens each time. But she'd never done it like this. She'd killed no one yet who wasn't in the process of trying to kill her. Looking at the man, she knew she might have to get over her reluctance and do it anyway, but decided it didn't have to be right then. Besides, it had been so long since the last time she had to kill a man, she felt she might learn something by talking. She dragged his body to a tree by the well out front, propped him in a sitting position with his back against the trunk, and wrapped fishing line around him again and again, enough so it would hold him until she was ready to do whatever it was she had to do next. Then she went inside Barney's cabin for one last look. That he'd found her meant she'd been too optimistic. She'd have to abandon the place for good this time. The war the aliens had started was not done yet. By the time she returned outside, he was awake. It surprised her to see he wasn't struggling against the line. That was what she had been doing if she'd found herself in that situation. He lifted his head, considering her coolly as if he was used to always being in control and was the kind of person who would never admit either to himself or to her that his current predicament had changed that. "Smart girl," he said, jutting his chin down toward where his chest was bound. "I'm no girl," she said. She thought of her own girl then and what had been done to her, and almost went for a knife right then, but resisted the impulse for now. "No, you're right," he continued. "You wouldn't be a girl, couldn't be, not to still be alive. A girl would never have made it this far." She started walking toward him, and he began to shout. "Don't come any closer," he cried, the muscles of his shoulders jerking. Back up, stay over there, we might have a chance to talk." "So you're infected," she said, taking a few steps back while keeping her eyes on the line she'd wrapped around him, hoping she'd bound him tight enough. She wasn't sure, she'd never had to do anything like that before. All she'd ever done to the other men was kill them. "Weren't we all?" he said. "No, we weren't all," she said bitterly. "Just men." "Just men," he repeated. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Isn't it obvious? I had to find you, and you had to be found. You're the last woman on earth, and I'm the last man." He shrugged, or rather moved his shoulders in what would have been a shrug had he not been tied up, as if to say, "Do I really have to tell you what needs to be done next?" "How can you be sure we're the last?" she asked, ignoring what he'd left unspoken. "I just know," he said. "Know without knowing. Turning men into killers wasn't the only change they made in us. We can sense you. Your existence is an itch we need to scratch. So eventually, we find you." Doesn't sound as if that change worked out very well. "Yes, you found me, and so did a few others." She nodded toward the mounds nearby. "But not all men," she continued. "If what you say is true, there should have been an army hunting for me up here. After we turned on you, we turned on each other. Isn't that always the way? Not that many survived, and those who did, not many had the skills to survive this far north." "And you had them?" Her question hung there, ending with a tone that signaled she was seeking more than one answer. So he gave her what she wanted. "Don," he said. "Don Fenton. And as to how I'm alive, let's just say Uncle Sam taught me well and leave it at that." "And you?" "Ann Alstein," she said. "Dr. Ann Alstein." He smiled. She did not like it. "Doctor," he said, "that's good. You'll be able to understand better than most what needs to be done and why. For now, at least, you should stay exactly where you are." "Don't you dare tell me what I should do," she said, taking a step forward. His breathing quickened in response. "Look, I mean it," he said. She took another step, and his lips curled, his hands balling at the fist. "Stop it," he said. "This isn't a game. I'm trying to fight this thing, but I won't be able to if you keep coming closer. We need to talk, and talk calmly. I can't do that unless you back off, please." "Talk about what?" "Seems to me the only thing we need to figure out is whether you'll kill me or I'll kill you. What else is there to talk about?" "It doesn't have to be this way," he said, his legs trembling, as if he were a dog running in its sleep. "The things are different now. That they're gone." "Who's gone?" He closed his eyes, beginning to breathe so quickly she thought he'd hyperventilate. She took a step back, then another, then a few more until she was almost standing in the doorway over whose lip he had tripped. "The aliens," he said, beginning to be more relaxed. "You don't think of them as angels then?" she said. No, I don't. Most men do. Most men use it as an excuse to..." She didn't feel she needed to say it. And no matter what he might later claim, she knew he'd probably done those things she didn't say. "I know better. I've known that from the beginning." "How could you? I didn't know that until it was almost the end. Because these aliens, they were not the first, there were others." "What did you see?" she said slowly, and with a hard tinge to her voice. She took half a step forward, fighting down a desire to get up into his face. She pulled her foot back, breathed deep, tried to calm herself. "Tell me." "It happened when I was down in Cozumel a few years back. I was hoping to make it to Belize to get some fishing done, but I never got there. My plane crashed, and before we were rescued, we saw those things." "We?" "Me, my pilot, and a couple of women. I went off for water with one of them so we could stay alive until we were found, and instead we found them. Actually, they found us." "Angels that long ago?" "They looked nothing like angels. They weren't glowing, couldn't have fooled anyone they were on a mission from God. They were tall and white and with limbs that could stretch out even longer than their bodies. They claimed they were students, or at least I think that's what they were saying, and once they helped us, they were gone. But the fact they'd been here at all showed me we're not alone in this universe. So when the next ones appeared, I knew. They were no angels. I knew who they were, and I know who we are. Amy stared at him silently until he looked away. She could tell it was a thing he did not do often or lightly. "There's something you're not telling me," she said. He did not respond, keeping his head turned to the nearby mounds. "What happened to the women?" she asked. He laughed, and it was an ugly laugh. "She wasn't even the same species as me," she said. "Claimed she was as different from me as I was from an opossum. That's what she thought of herself, as you know. Merely an opossum. They're all around us," she said, "but we don't even see them." "What the hell are you talking about? Tell me what happened to the women, Don." "You're just like them," he said. "I should have realized it before. Just another opossum." "Tell me now, Don, what happened to the women?" She found herself coming closer before she was even aware of thinking of coming closer, and he writhed uncontrollably until the cord cut through the cloth of his shirt, cut through more than just cloth, and blood was running down his arms. He gritted his teeth and rocked forward, surging to meet her approach, but could not reach her. "I'll kill you," he shouted, his veneer of control defeated. "I'll gut you and kill you." "Did you kill them?" she asked, standing over him as still as he was wild. "Is that what you did to the women, Don? Kill them?" He shook his head, gritted his teeth, grunted, and smacked his head back against the trunk until tears ran down his cheeks. She could hear, as he grimaced, the cracking of a tooth. "No, I didn't kill them. They're gone. The aliens took those two crazy bitches, and they wanted to go, said they didn't belong here, that they were a different species. Can you believe that? They wanted to go. They wanted to go." He repeated that last sentence over and over until it seemed as if he would never stop in the grip of a fugue state which would have killed them both if she'd let it. She backed away, circling around to the opposite side of the cabin, and sank to the ground against it, relieved to have it between them. Eventually, his whimpering stopped. "We're it, you know," he said, his voice calmer now that she was out of sight and further away. "You and me, that's all that's left. That's why I came here. That's why I've been trying to control myself. If we don't do something, if we don't take action, the human race dies here." "Are you serious?" she called out, suddenly parsing his meaning. "You really believe you're going to get a chance to fuck me?" She laughed, and even though it was a hateful laugh, one she hoped hurt him, the laughter over his dreams of action. Action, what kind of a euphemism was that? Felt good because it had been a long time since she'd had a laugh of any kind. "This world is not ours any longer," she said, once her laughter had stopped. "It belongs to them now. I don't know what they have planned, but those plans don't include us. That's what this was all about. This planet, we've lost it. How have you not figured that out?" "We won't have lost it until they come back," he said. "And don't you see, who knows how long that will be? Who knows how the aliens even measure time? It could be years before they return, decades, and if we're lucky, centuries. We've got to try, Anne. We can't let it end here. We've got to keep living. Surely you can see that." She thought of herself night after night by the rock beside the swamp, and how many times it almost did end there. She looked at her wrists lined with scars, too many to count, but none quite deep enough. He was crazy if he thought the species could go on, crazier if he thought they could do it together. "And you really think you'll be able to get near me?" She didn't hide the disgust in her voice. She didn't even try. "To mount me and shoot the future into me? You think they'll let you? You think I'll let you?" She thought of Alan then. Alan's voice, Alan's touch, the promise of what they foolishly counted as infinite tomorrows. Damn him, why couldn't he have stayed in Columbia? Why did he have to rush back to her? If only he'd waited. But if what Don said about us being the last of men was true, waiting wouldn't have saved him. "We'll think of a way," he said. "We can't allow ourselves to be the last. We have to think of a way." Did they? She had no answer to that. No way, not even a desire for a way, and so she sat quietly, not replying to his calling of her name. She regretted even telling it to him. He didn't deserve to be the one to use it. Eventually, night began to fall, and the stars started to come out, looking oh so very different than they had that morning. She shivered at the increasing cold. She rose and went to the front of the cabin and kept her eyes on him as his gaze tracked her to the door. He didn't speak, which told her he had at least some sense. Inside, she took the remains of a tattered blanket and draped some of the shreds around her shoulders. She carried the rest to the man, only approaching as close as she needed, which wasn't very close at all, to toss the rest around his shoulders. Then she backed away to sit against the cabin and watch him in the moonlight, wondering which of them would break the silence first. They stared at each other like that, the last man and the last woman, one wanting everything, one wanting nothing. "I didn't come here to kill you," he said eventually. "You have to know that. And my husband didn't come home to kill my daughter," she said. "And the sons of Adam and the Pauline purification cult, they didn't want to kill either. They only wanted to become closer to God. What you want doesn't matter, and if you think you didn't come here to kill me, you haven't been listening to the blood pulsing through your veins, blood which is right now outside you, running down your arms. Don't lie to me, Don. Don't lie to yourself. You came here to kill me, all right." Perhaps you're right. Perhaps I'm lying to myself, but as long as we keep our distance, nothing bad will happen to either one of us. I'm in control. I'm okay. "No," she said. "No, you're not. You're a bear trap waiting to be sprung. And I can't have you around worrying every moment that you'll snap shut. When my time comes, it's not going to be at your hands. You don't get to win. They don't get to win. I'm telling you, it doesn't have to be that way. If you'd known me before, you'd know I'm as much a cynic as you can get. I was never one to get sentimental, but I believe life can go on. We can do this. We can be another Adam and Eve." She snorted. "That's just the alien in you talking, Don, hoping to convince me to lower my guard so you can end the job they started. Besides, there's no way you can knock me up if we have to always keep 30 feet between us. There's always a way, darling." She grimaced at that word. "Darling," she said, and then laughed. "Jesus, you're mad. Well, I guess after all this time, I'm mad too. Neither of us is mad. It's more like we're inevitable. Just like," now he laughed. "Like who?" He shook his head, astonished by something he'd yet to share. "Like Captain Esteban and that Althea girl." She frowned at the word, but he jumped in before she could speak. "No, that one really was a girl," he said. "And you see, the thing is, when her mother and I went for water, what I didn't realize until later was she left them alone deliberately. She wanted her daughter to get herself pregnant and carry a kid away to the stars. The same way we got left here alone deliberately by the universe so that we could bring a kid into the world right here. It all makes sense now." "Wait, she what? Someone's pregnant? Up there?" He nodded. "Up there, Lord knows where. She knew, oh, that Ruth Parsons, she knew exactly what she was doing when she volunteered to head off with me. She knew both of them would be leaving, and she knew wherever she'd be going, she needs something more for the race to live on. On a planet circling one of those stars, somewhere out there, there's a baby unlike any human baby that's ever been, or maybe not a baby anymore. Time could work differently out there, remember? Who knows where he's been? Who knows what he's seen? The last of us now, well, except for those two opossums. But he doesn't have to be the last of us." "The last of us," she repeated, saying coldly what he had said so hopefully. She stared at the blood which by now was seeping through the strips of blanket. "I'm sorry, Don." "Sorry for what? There's no need of sorries now." She stood and began walking toward him, knowing now what she'd have to do next. And what she'd have to do next she'll have to find by buying the book and reading the story, because that's as much time as I have today. Thanks for coming. It's in this collection. Tell me what you've done before. There's a postcard at the cover here if you like it, and take a cookie as you go. Thank you.